The thunder of hoofbeats echoed across the dusty plains as Preston O'Malley rode like the devil himself was on his heels. 6 lawmen in close pursuit, and a bullet wound seeping blood down his left arm. It was 1878 in the Arizona Territory, and Preston had just added another crime to his long list of offenses, this time robbing the Tucson First National Bank in broad daylight. Faster, Storm. He growled at his midnight black stallion, gripping the reins with white knuckles as they plunged into a narrow canyon. The saddlebags heavy with stolen cash bounced against his leg, a reminder of why he couldn't afford to be caught. The lawman's shouts faded as Preston navigated the twisting passages of the canyon, a route he'd memorized years ago for just such an occasion. His breath came in ragged gasps, the pain in his arm intensifying with each jarring step his horse took. The bullet had only grazed him, but it was enough to leave a trail of blood, a trail that would make him easy to track if he didn't find somewhere to hole up soon. As the canyon opened into a small valley, Preston spotted a modest homestead tucked against the far hillside. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting someone was home. His instincts told him to avoid it. Witnesses were a complication he didn't need, but the lightheadedness from blood loss was becoming harder to ignore. "Damn it all," he muttered, steering Storm toward the property. He'd demand bandages and water, then be on his way before the law caught up. As he approached, he noticed the neat rows of crops, the well-maintained fence, and a small herd of cattle grazing nearby. It was a proper working ranch, modest but prosperous. More surprising was the solitary figure in a dress tending to a garden near the house, her back to him as she worked the soil. Preston drew his revolver, wincing at the movement. "Hello, the house," he called out, his voice rougher than intended. The woman turned, shading her eyes with one hand. She didn't scream or run at the sight of a blood-soaked man with a gun. Instead, she straightened, brushed soil from her hands, and walked calmly toward him. "State your business, sir," she called, her voice firm and unafraid. Preston blinked in surprise. Most decent women would be terrified to find a wounded outlaw on their doorstep. "I need bandages and water," he said, gesturing with his gun. "Then I'll be on my way." As she approached, he got a better look at her. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25, with copper-colored hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her face was striking, not traditionally beautiful, but memorable, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of a summer storm. "You're bleeding all over my property," she observed, her gaze moving from his wounded arm to the gun in his hand, then to his face. "I'm Nora Griffith, and you're trespassing." Preston nearly laughed at her audacity. "Lady, I've got a gun pointed at you." "And I've got a shotgun aimed at your back," came a male voice from behind. Preston tensed but didn't turn. A classic trap. "Tell your husband to lower his weapon, or—" "That's my brother," Nora interrupted. "And neither of us is afraid of you, mister. So why don't you put that gun away before you hurt yourself worse than you already are?" Against his better judgment, Preston glanced back. Sure enough, a young man stood on the porch, shotgun trained steadily on him. They had him dead to rights. "Fine," Preston growled, holstering his weapon. "I need help and then I'll be gone." Nora's expression didn't change. "You're running from the law. It wasn't a question." "What makes you say that?" "Because honest men don't arrive bleeding with saddlebags that jingle like that," she replied. "Nathan, keep that shotgun handy while I tend to his wound." "Nora, we should turn him in," her brother protested. "We will," she replied calmly, "after I've stopped him from bleeding to death on our property. I won't have a death on my conscience, even an outlaw's." Preston swayed in the saddle, the world suddenly tilting. "I'm not going to die from a graze," he muttered, but his vision was narrowing alarmingly. The last thing he remembered was Nora stepping forward as he tumbled from the saddle, her face showing the first hint of concern he'd seen. When Preston woke, he was lying on a narrow bed in a small, neat room. His shirt was gone, his arm bandaged, and most alarmingly his gun belt was nowhere to be seen. He tried to sit up but fell back with a groan as pain lanced through his arm. "I wouldn't move too quickly if I were you," Nora said from the doorway. "You lost more blood than you realized." Preston glared at her. "Where are my things?" "Your weapons are with Nathan. Your horse is in our stable, getting better care than you've given him recently." She moved into the room, setting a tray with a steaming bowl on the bedside table. "The saddlebags are secure." "Meaning you haven't stolen from me," Preston said with a bitter laugh. "That's rich, considering." Nora's eyes flashed. "Considering what? That you're a thief." "Yes, we figured that out when we heard the news about the bank robbery in Tucson. You're Preston O'Malley. There's a sizable reward for your capture." Preston tensed. "So you're turning me in, eventually." She sat on a chair beside the bed. "But first you're going to heal and work." That startled a laugh from him. "Work? Lady, I'll be gone the moment you turn your back." "With what horse? What weapons? What money?" She shook her head. "Nathan has hidden everything, and in case you're thinking of taking mine, you should know everyone in the county knows my stallion. You'd be caught within hours." Preston stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. There was steel beneath that calm exterior. "What kind of work?" "We need help with the harvest. Nathan injured his back last month and we're behind schedule." She gestured to his bandaged arm. "Once that's healed enough, you'll earn your keep. And then you turn me in for the reward," he said flatly. Nora's expression didn't waver. "Yes, the law is the law, Mr. O'Malley. I don't make exceptions, even for a man who might hang." The words came out more bitter than he intended. Something flickered in her eyes. "Eat your soup. You'll need your strength." She stood and walked to the door. "And Mr. O'Malley, don't try to escape. Nathan's a light sleeper, and he wouldn't mind shooting you in the leg to slow you down." With that, she was gone, leaving Preston alone with his thoughts and a growing realization that he might have met his match in this unassuming woman who lived by rules as rigid as oak. The next few days passed in a frustrating blur of confinement and grudging recovery. True to her word, Nora kept him fed and tended to his wound with clinical efficiency, never showing fear or uncertainty in his presence. Her brother Nathan was less composed, watching Preston with open suspicion and keeping the shotgun conspicuously visible whenever they were in the same room. By the fourth day, Preston's wound had improved enough that Nora declared him fit for light work. "You'll start by helping with the chickens," she informed him over breakfast. "Nothing too strenuous." Preston scowled. "I'm not a farmhand." "No, you're a thief and a fugitive," she replied evenly. "But today, you're feeding chickens." He might have argued further, but there was something in her steady gaze that made the words die in his throat. Instead, he followed her outside, squinting in the bright morning sunlight. The Griffith ranch was more impressive in daylight. The main house was modest but solidly built, with a wide porch and sturdy outbuildings. Fields of corn and wheat stretched to the east, while cattle grazed on hillside pastures to the north. It was a well-run operation, especially for a woman and her injured brother. "Your parents?" Preston asked as they walked toward the chicken coop. "Dead," Nora said simply. "Fever took them 3 years ago. So you and your brother run this place alone. We hire hands during busy seasons. Nathan handles the cattle, I manage the crops and accounts." She handed him a bucket of feed. "Most folks thought we'd sell and move to town. We proved them wrong." There was quiet pride in her voice, and Preston found himself unexpectedly impressed. Most women would have married or sold the property, not taken on the burden of running a ranch. The days fell into a pattern. Preston's duties increased as his arm healed, moving from chickens to garden work to helping Nathan with fence repairs. He watched for opportunities to escape, but found them surprisingly scarce. Nathan kept the firearms locked away, and Storm was always secured in the stable at night. More surprising was how quickly he adapted to the rhythm of ranch life. The physical labor was hard but honest, leaving him pleasantly exhausted at day's end. He found himself sleeping better than he had in years, undisturbed by the usual nightmares of pursuit. A week into his stay, Preston was chopping wood behind the house when he heard raised voices from inside. Curious, he moved closer to an open window. "Can't keep him here forever, Nora," Nathan was saying. "Sheriff Wilson will be passing through next week. We should turn O'Malley in." "He's still recovering," Nora replied, "and we need the help with harvest. The man's dangerous. He's robbed half the banks between here and Texas." "He's working well enough," Nora countered. "Have you noticed how much he's accomplished already? The east fence is repaired, the garden's been weeded." "So what?" Nathan demanded. "You going to give him a medal for doing what any honest man would do for pay? He's only working because we have his money and weapons." There was a pause before Nora spoke again, her voice quieter. "I think there's more to him than his crimes, Nathan." Preston froze, the axe halfway through a log. "Don't tell me you're falling for him," Nathan groaned. "For God's sake, Nora, the man's an outlaw." "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "I'm simply saying people can change given the chance." "Some people don't deserve chances," Nathan replied bitterly. "You think O'Malley cares about the people he's hurt, the lives he's ruined?" Preston backed away from the window, unsettled by the conversation. He returned to his wood chopping with renewed vigor, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling in his chest. He wasn't seeking redemption or second chances. He was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to escape with his loot. Nothing more. So why did Nathan's words sting more than they should have? That evening, as Preston helped Nora with the dishes after dinner, she seemed preoccupied, her usual efficiency replaced by distracted movements. "Something on your mind?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. She glanced at him, then back to the plate she was drying. "I was wondering about your story, Mr. O'Malley." "Not much to tell," he replied cautiously. "I doubt that." She set the plate down. "Men don't become outlaws without a reason." Preston snorted. "Some do. Some just find they're good at taking what they want." "And is that your story?" Her gray eyes studied him intently. "You simply woke up one day and decided to start robbing banks." He shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "Why do you care?" "Because I believe people can change," she said simply. "But first, they need to understand why they need changing." Preston handed her the last dish, suddenly eager to escape this conversation. "You're wasting your time, Miss Griffith. I am what I am." "And what exactly is that?" she pressed. "A man who breaks rules," he said flatly. "Always have been." Nora dried her hands on her apron, her expression thoughtful. Even as a boy, the question caught him off guard. Memories surfaced unbidden: his father's fists, his mother's tears, the day he'd finally fought back at 16 and been thrown out into the world with nothing but the clothes on his back. "Especially as a boy," he said finally. "Rules were made for breaking in my house. My father taught me that." Something in his tone must have revealed more than he intended, because Nora's expression softened slightly. "Sometimes the rules we break as children aren't the same ones we break as men." Before he could respond, she picked up the lantern. "It's late. Nathan will lock your door as usual." As she left, Preston remained by the sink, wondering why he'd shared even that small piece of his past with her. Wondering even more why her belief in change had lodged like a splinter in his thoughts, impossible to ignore. The next day brought a challenge Preston hadn't anticipated. A thunderstorm rolled in from the west, bringing with it driving rain and howling winds. By mid-morning, the creek that bordered the eastern edge of the property had swollen dangerously. "The cattle," Nathan said, bursting into the barn where Preston was mending tack. "They're in the lower pasture." "If the creek floods, they'll be trapped," Preston finished. He'd seen it happen before, entire herds drowned when waters rose too quickly. "Where's your sister?" Already riding out to open the gate to the high ground. Nathan looked torn. "I need to go help her, but someone needs to check the irrigation channels or the crops will wash away." Preston made a quick decision. "Give me a horse. I'll help with the cattle." Nathan hesitated. "You could run." "In this storm, I'm not that stupid." Preston stood. "Besides, your sister shouldn't be out there alone." After a moment's consideration, Nathan nodded. "Take the bay gelding. He's steady in bad weather." He gestured to a rack of slickers. "And for God's sake, don't get yourself killed. Nora would never forgive me." Minutes later, Preston was galloping through the downpour toward the lower pasture, rain stinging his face despite the slicker. The creek had already breached its banks in places, turning parts of the trail into muddy quagmires. He found Nora at the pasture gate, struggling to herd the frightened cattle toward higher ground. Her horse was dancing nervously as lightning cracked overhead, making the task even harder. "Get to the back of the herd," she shouted when she spotted him. "Keep them moving toward that ridge." Preston didn't waste time acknowledging the order. He urged his mount around the perimeter of the panicking cattle, using the skills he'd learned years ago working cattle drives in Texas. Together, he and Nora gradually turned the herd, pushing them through the open gate and up the slope toward safety. They had nearly succeeded when disaster struck. A massive crack of thunder sent the lead steer bolting back toward the creek, causing a chain reaction as others followed. Nora's horse reared in alarm, throwing her from the saddle. She hit the ground hard and didn't immediately rise. Preston didn't hesitate. He abandoned the herd and galloped to where Nora lay in the mud, rain pelting her still form. Dismounting in a fluid motion, he knelt beside her. "Nora!" He shouted over the storm. "Nora, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, confusion evident. "The cattle, forget the damn cattle," he said, quickly checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" She winced as she tried to sit up. "My ankle, I think it's sprained, not broken." Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by concern as he spotted her horse disappearing into the distance. The creek water was rising rapidly around them, already ankle-deep where they sat. "We need to move," he said urgently. "Can you ride with me?" She nodded, gritting her teeth as he helped her to her feet. When she couldn't put weight on her injured ankle, Preston made a quick decision. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to his horse, ignoring her protests. "This isn't proper," she objected as he settled her in the saddle and mounted behind her. Despite everything, Preston laughed. "We're about to be swept away in a flash flood and you're worried about propriety." "The rules exist for a reason," she replied, though there was a hint of humor in her voice now. "Sometimes breaking them keeps you alive," he countered, urging the horse toward higher ground. They rode in silence for several minutes, Preston's arm secure around Nora's waist to keep her steady. The rain gradually lessened as they climbed, until they reached a sheltered overhang where they could rest the horse. "The cattle?" Nora asked once they'd dismounted, Preston supporting her weight. "Most made it to the ridge," he assured her. "The rest will find their way or Nathan will round them up." She nodded, then looked at him with an odd expression. "You could have run," Preston met her gaze, "and left you to drown. What kind of man do you think I am?" "A bank robber," she replied softly. "A man who breaks every rule." "Not that one," he said, surprising himself with his vehemence. "Never that one." Something shifted in her expression, a softening he hadn't seen before. "Thank you, Preston." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice did strange things to his chest. "You're welcome, Nora." They stood together under the rocky overhang, watching the storm gradually subside, neither acknowledging the subtle change that had occurred between them. But Preston felt it a crack in the wall he'd built around himself, allowing something unexpected to seep through. The days following the storm brought changes to the Griffith ranch. With Nora's ankle healing, Preston took on more responsibilities, working alongside Nathan to repair storm damage and tend to the crops and cattle. To his surprise, he found satisfaction in the work, pride in seeing immediate results from his labor. More surprising was the change in how the Griffith siblings treated him. Nathan's suspicion gradually gave way to grudging respect, especially after Preston showed him a more efficient method for mending fence posts. And Nora watched him, not with fear or distrust, but with curiosity and something else he couldn't quite define. Their conversations grew longer, ranging from practical ranch matters to books they'd read to childhood memories. Preston found himself sharing stories he'd told no one about the teacher who'd encouraged his reading, the first horse he'd trained, the Texas Ranger who'd given him a chance before he'd thrown it away. In turn, Nora told him about her parents, her dreams for the ranch, her stubborn refusal to sell when her neighbors insisted a woman couldn't manage such property. "Rules again," she explained one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "Everyone has rules about what women can and cannot do. But you follow the law," Preston observed. "Every letter of it," she nodded. "Because laws protect people. They maintain order." She glanced at him. "Breaking them hurts others even when you don't see it directly." The words hit closer to home than he liked to admit. "Sometimes the law isn't just," he argued, thinking of the Native American families he'd seen forced from their lands, the poor farmers crushed by wealthy cattle barons with law on their side. "Then work to change it," she countered. "Don't just break it for your own benefit." Preston fell silent, contemplating her words. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning the path he'd chosen. What had started as survival had become a habit, then a way of life. He'd never stopped to consider the people on the other side of his gun, the tellers who feared for their lives, the townspeople whose savings he stole. 2 weeks after the storm, Sheriff Wilson's visit loomed on the horizon. Preston knew his time at the ranch was running short, yet he found himself reluctant to leave. One afternoon, while helping Nora in the garden, he broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "The sheriff comes tomorrow," he said, keeping his tone casual as he dug up potatoes. Nora's hands stilled in the soil. "Yes, you're still planning to turn me in." It wasn't a question. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I have to, Preston. The law is the law," he finished. "I know." She studied him, her gray eyes troubled. "You could run tonight." "Nathan's going to town for supplies. He won't be back until morning." Preston straightened, genuinely shocked by her suggestion. "You'd let me go?" "No," she said firmly. "I'd report you missing. I'd tell the sheriff everything I know, but—" She hesitated. "You'd have a head start." The offer hung between them, unexpected and complicated. Preston found himself torn in a way he'd never experienced before. The old Preston would have taken the chance without hesitation, gathered his things and vanished into the night. Another town, another robbery, continuing the cycle. But something had changed during his time at the Griffith Ranch. He'd glimpsed another kind of life, one built on honest work and accountability. He'd seen Nora's unwavering commitment to what was right, even when it was difficult. "And if I stayed," he asked quietly, "if I faced what's coming?" Nora's expression was a mix of hope and resignation. The bank robbery carries a sentence. Years, probably, but she took a deep breath. You saved my life, Preston. I would testify to that. And to the work you've done here, the person I believe you could be. Preston knelt beside her in the garden row, close enough to see the flecks of blue in her gray eyes. Why would you do that for me? Because I believe people can change when they choose to, she said simply. Even angry cowboys who break every rule. He laughed softly at her characterization. And what about proper young ladies who never break any? Perhaps, she said, a smile tugging at her lips. They can learn there are times when bending a rule might be necessary. Before he could respond, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his briefly, softly, a gesture that defied her own standards of propriety. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed, but her gaze was steady. That was definitely against the rules, Preston murmured, fighting the urge to pull her close again. Consider it incentive, she replied, returning to her gardening with deliberate focus, for making the right choice. That night, Preston lay awake long after the house had fallen silent, weighing his options. His saddlebags with the stolen money were hidden somewhere on the property. His guns and horse were accessible now that Nathan was gone. He could be miles away by dawn, starting fresh somewhere new. Yet Nora's words echoed in his mind. People can change when they choose to. The question was whether he was brave enough to face consequences rather than run from them as he always had. Around midnight, he made his decision. Sheriff Wilson arrived shortly after breakfast, a tall man with a weathered face and keen eyes that missed nothing. He accepted Nora's offer of coffee, his gaze immediately fixing on Preston. Miss Griffith mentioned in town last week that you were harboring a wounded traveler, the sheriff said carefully. Didn't mention it was Preston O'Malley. Preston set down his cup. She didn't know at first, and when she found out, the sheriff's hand rested casually near his holster. I decided he should heal before facing justice, Nora interjected. He's been working off his keep in the meantime. Sheriff Wilson raised an eyebrow. That true, O'Malley? You've been playing ranch hand instead of running, Preston nodded. Yes, sir. And I'm prepared to return what I took from the bank in Tucson. This clearly surprised the sheriff. All of it. Every dollar, Preston confirmed. It's hidden on the property. I'll take you to it. The sheriff studied him thoughtfully. You understand you're still looking at prison time. Armed robbery isn't something a judge will overlook, returned money or not. I understand, Preston said quietly, aware of Nora watching him. But I'm done running. An hour later, the stolen money was recovered from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard in the barn. As Sheriff Wilson counted it, Nora pulled Preston aside. You're really doing this, she said, wonder in her voice. Seems I've finally found something worth changing for, he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. Someone worth changing for. Nora's expression softened. Prison won't be easy. No, he agreed. But when I get out, if you'll wait, I'd like to come back, start fresh, do things right. As a ranch hand, she asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. As whatever you'll have me be, he answered honestly. Sheriff Wilson cleared his throat behind them. Time to go, O'Malley. Preston nodded, turning to face the sheriff. Just one moment, if you don't mind. The sheriff hesitated, then stepped back, giving them a small measure of privacy. Preston took Nora's hands in his. I don't have the right to ask you to wait for me. No, she agreed, you don't. Then her grip tightened on his. But I will anyway. Rules can bend for the right reasons. He smiled, memorizing her face, the strength and compassion that had somehow reached past his defenses. I'll write, and I'll count the days. So will I, she promised. And when you return, there will be work waiting for you, a place for you. And you, he asked softly. Yes, she whispered. And me. Their goodbye kiss was brief but filled with promise, a beginning rather than an end. As Sheriff Wilson led him away, Preston looked back once to see Nora standing tall on the porch, her copper hair catching the morning sun, her expression one of determined hope. For the first time in his life, Preston O'Malley rode toward consequences instead of away from them, carrying with him the knowledge that something better awaited on the other side. He had broken every rule he'd ever known, but in Nora Griffith, a woman who broke none, he had found a reason to build a life within them instead. 3 years later, Preston stood at the gates of Yuma Territorial Prison, a free man at last. The sun beat down mercilessly on the desert landscape, but he barely noticed the heat. His attention was fixed on the solitary figure waiting beside a wagon on the dusty road. Nora hadn't changed much, perhaps a few more freckles across her nose, a new confidence in the way she held herself. Their letters had sustained them both during his imprisonment, each page reinforcing the connection that had formed during those weeks on her ranch. "You came," he said as he reached her, suddenly uncertain despite their correspondence. "I said I would," she replied simply. Then, breaking one of her own rules about public displays, she stepped forward and embraced him, her arms strong and sure around his shoulders. Preston held her close, breathing in the scent of lavender and sunshine that he'd carried in his memory through the long prison nights. "The ranch." "Thriving," she said, pulling back to look at him. "Nathan married last year. They have a little boy now. And you?" he asked, searching her face. "How have you been?" Nora smiled, the full, unguarded smile he'd seen so rarely during their first meeting. "Waiting, working, learning that some rules matter more than others." As they climbed into the wagon for the journey home, Preston marveled at the turn his life had taken. The angry cowboy who had lived by no law, but his own had found grace in the arms of a woman whose principles had never wavered yet, who had somehow found room in those principles for him. "I have something for you," Nora said as they left the prison behind. She handed him a small leather pouch. Inside, Preston found a simple gold ring. His eyes widened in question. "I thought we might need it," she explained, a faint blush coloring her cheeks, "if you still want what we talked about in our letters." Preston slipped the ring onto his finger, then took her hand in his. "I do," he said, the words a promise and a vow. "More than anything." As they rode toward the future they'd build together, Preston reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had broken every rule and suffered the consequences, but in doing so had found a path to redemption. And Nora, who had lived her life by unwavering standards, had taught him the value of rules while learning when love required flexibility. Together, they had found a balanced justice tempered with mercy, principles guided by compassion. And in that balance, they had discovered something neither could have found alone, a love strong enough to wait, to endure, to transform. The Arizona sun blazed overhead as they drove toward home, casting no shadows on the road ahead.